you, Ronnie. Appreciate that introduction. And Ronnie, I appreciate all the good work that you and the other members of the lecture series have done in putting this series together. Also want to welcome Peggy Morey. Where are you, Peggy? You're out there. You are, Peggy, from, as I think many of you are familiar, from the Talbot Historical Society. And this is sort of a unique part of the lecture series, if I'm not mistaken, in that we have folks from the Historical Society as well as from here in our neighborhood. So thank you, everyone who's been involved in this. I'm going to talk about that. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about me. Give you a little bit of a sense as to how I came here today, 6 years after arriving here in Easton, to be talking about this topic. My wife and I arrived down here at the Easton Club East 6 years ago. Prior to our purchase of our home, I'd never heard of Easton. I was only dimly aware of the Eastern Shore. I thought the Eastern Shore was pretty much like the Jersey Shore, the Long Island Shore, the New England Shore. It was all shore. And there was not much else to distinguish it from one shore to another. And then I got here, and I found out much the contrary, that this place called the Eastern Shore was a very different kind of place. And particularly as I began to delve into the history of the Eastern Shore, I found out that it was a different kind of place. As you just heard, I've done a fair amount of work in the general topic of emancipation, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the late 19th century. And prior to getting down here, I was of the notion that this story was a pretty simple one in some terms. You had the northern states, in which there was some sentiment in favor of this thing called Reconstruction after the Civil War, in which there was some positive sentiment towards doing something for the black population that had recently been enslaved. And then you had the southern states, states that I was familiar with, that I had done work in: Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, even Virginia, in which at least the native population, the native white populations in those states, had been hostile, to say the least, to this notion of freedom and all that freedom meant for the recently enslaved black population. And then I got here and found out that the story was not quite so simple here on the Eastern Shore. To put it simply, here on the Eastern Shore, we had something that not I, but others have labeled the middle way. Neither north nor south, but something distinctive. As I began to delve into the history of this area, two books that I found of some use. Some of you may be very familiar with them. The best history I found of Maryland is this one: Maryland, A Middle Temperament. The title, right off, told me something about what the book was going to talk about. That this state, Maryland, was somehow different. It's a pretty encyclopedic work, but if you're interested in the history of this state, doesn't get any more comprehensive than Robert Bruger's Maryland, the Middle Temperament. And then I picked up this book. Some of you may be familiar with it. Talbot County, A History, by Dixon Preston. Who's seen it? Okay, we've got a few hands who've gone up. If you have the opportunity and are at all interested, it's an eminent, let me underline that 9 times, eminently readable book. Preston really does a wonderful job. It's illustrated. The only problem is it's hard to find. It's out of print, unfortunately, and you're probably going to pay a gazillion dollars if you do find a copy. But if you can get a hold of it, it's really very good. So I read those 2 books and began to delve into more history and decided, my God, this is interesting. And the other thing that struck me was that not a whole lot had been done in terms of telling the story, particularly of this period after the Civil War, and why it was different from other areas of the country, particularly other areas of the South. So I read, I researched over at Peggy's place, the Talbot Historical Society, went next door to the public library. Public library down here is both Peggy's Historical Society and the public library are wonderful institutions. And quite frankly, not institutions that I thought I would find here in this relatively small town of Easton. And yet here in this small town are 2 institutions devoted to the history of Talbot County and doing a wonderful job of it. So I parked myself for a couple of years in both places and did some research and was fortunate enough to have 3 articles published on this in, where are they? Maryland Historical Magazine. So what I'd like to do today in maybe a half hour's time is to summarize a little of what I learned and then throw it open to you folks to harass me as you will if you have questions about this. And the questions I can't answer, maybe some of you can answer who know a lot about this topic. So, what did I find? Let's go, who's doing the slides here? This always happens.
Sorry. I'm not a good clicker. Okay, there you go.
Okay, the first area I'd like to look at is a broad sweep of the social and political situation here on the Eastern Shore after the Civil War. If we could go on from that, and go on from that,
Okay.
and go on from that, and there we go. So here's the Eastern Shore, or here's the map of the Eastern United States, and if we could go one step further, there is the Eastern Shore, the star, and if we go one step further than that, here is Talbot County. And one of the interesting things about Talbot County, as I think all of you are aware, or at least many of you are aware, is that it is pretty much surrounded by water. In fact, recent fact that I came upon was that Talbot County has more water surrounding it than any county in the United States. And that shaped much of its history. If we could move on. After the Civil War, this county became known as the land of the gentry. You see that title around. Anybody know what estate building that is?
Lloyd Estate?
Excuse me? No, that's Y House, W-Y-E, Y House. It's over on Miles River Neck, not far from Unionville, and it was the home of the largest plantation on the Eastern Shore, the Lloyds owned it. The Lloyds pretty much ruled this area for over 200 years. Edwin Lloyd, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and the eighth. Descendants of the family, as far as I'm aware, still own that house. At one time, it was the largest plantation, as they say, in the whole Eastern Shore, may have been the largest plantation in all of Maryland. 400 enslaved individuals worked on that plantation. Right here, it's in Talbot County. The folks, like Lloyd and other plantation owners, pretty much set the tone for this county after the Civil War. But there was another reality side by side with that reality. That's the next slide. That's the other reality. 1/3 of the population of Talbot County after the Civil War was black. Half of those people had been slaves, half had not. Talbot County, like much of Maryland, between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, had been slowly but surely freeing many of its slaves. Now, when you hear the fact white folk had been freeing black folk from slavery, you might think, well, wasn't that nice? Actually, for most of those white folks, it had nothing to do with being nice. It rather had to do with sheer economics. Here in Maryland, and particularly on the Eastern Shore, during the period of the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, leading right up to the Civil War, it simply no longer made good economic sense to hold people as slaves. You could make more money by hiring those folks. Hiring them at very low wages and not having to support them once they were no longer viable workers for you, as opposed to slaveholders who were pretty much compelled to support slaves irrespective of whether they were doing a job for you or not. And so many blacks were freed. But irrespective of whether they were free or not, that's how they lived. All right, we can go on. Interesting situation then after the war was that here in Talbot County, the situation for black workers who were now free, and there were approximately 10 to 12,000 black people in Talbot County after the Civil War, was that they really had two choices now that they were free. They could stay in Talbot County or they could leave. Many chose to leave. And they chose to leave for one fundamental reason. It was hard, very, very hard, keeping body and soul together if you were a black person in Talbot County after the Civil War. Economic opportunity was not readily available. And so many blacks left. Where did they go? They tended to go north. Baltimore was the #1 location where many blacks went. Washington, D.C., a second location. Philadelphia. But Baltimore was the prime location. Some tried to have it both ways. There was a fair number of black people after the Civil War who would literally commute. Now, they didn't commute on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. It was more of a seasonal basis that they would commute to Baltimore, work, and come back home. Others, however, stayed. And these folks who stayed had some advantages. And they used those advantages for their own well-being. The primary advantage that they had was that there weren't too many of them anymore. That labor was relatively scarce. And they were free to move. The result of which was, and here, let me read you a quote. This is from the Easton Ledger. Probably haven't heard of the Easton Ledger. I don't think it's been published in 100 years. But this was back in the 1880s. And the Easton Ledger reports that house servants, black females, in Easton at this time are like the Frenchman's flea. When you put your finger on them, they're not there. They may get breakfast, dinner, or supper for you, if they're your servant. But when the lady of the house goes out for the next meal, the servant is likely not to be there. But they're at one of the packing houses, paring peaches, and not in the kitchen. What that quote is referring to is that in the late 19th century here in Talbot County, packing houses began to be developed. Packing houses based on fishing industry, vegetables of one sort or another, and packing houses were established to pack those items and ship them off to urban areas. And those packing houses needed labor. And they competed with traditional jobs like house servants and field labor that blacks had done. And many blacks use that to their advantage. And there's all sorts of quotes, like the one I just read, of people, white people, tearing their hair out because they weren't used to black people, be it free or slave, prior to the Civil War, acting like they had control over their lives. What are they thinking? They control their lives. But of course, they did control their lives to an extent. So, the other, we can go on. Could we jump ahead for that, Peggy? Yeah, go back.
Go back.
Yeah, go back one. Yeah. Many males, black males, did this. What are they doing? Yeah, yeah. This was an activity. I couldn't do it. Maybe you could, but I couldn't. Incredibly grueling activity of going out and crabbing, so to speak. You've seen those, what are they called? Tongs? I mean, they must be 8, 10, 12 feet long. Can you imagine doing this day in, day out? Yeah. But many black males did it gladly. And they did it gladly for two reasons. Number one, they didn't have to report to anybody. They were their own bosses, unlike prior to the Civil War. And number two, they could set their own schedule. They could work when they wanted to, and they could not work when they wanted to. And that drove white folks crazy, that black folks would set their own schedule. What's the matter with them? They're not working 6 days a week anymore. Can you imagine? Moving on. And here are pictures of black females in the packing houses. Going on, politics and education. One area that blacks gladly became involved in was politics. Blacks gained the right to vote by which amendment? Which amendment? Which amendment? 15th Amendment, right. Okay. 1868. Now, the typical Southern story of black voting after the Civil War is that blacks get the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, and then all hell breaks loose. And by 1875, 1876, organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and others throughout the South have effectively put an end to black voting. And blacks, from that time, in many areas of the South, are prevented from voting right up to the 1950s, the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act. That's not the story here in Talbot County. Here in Talbot County, blacks continue to vote right on through the early years of the 20th century. And they do it for two reasons. Number one, because they insist they are going to vote. And despite white efforts to stop them, they continue to vote. And they continue to vote in large numbers. Turnouts of 70, 80, and 90%. Turnouts that today are unheard of. Today, if 50% of folks go out to vote. It's incredible. Could we hold the questions toward the question and answer period?
I just wanted to say black men.
Yeah. What was that?
Black men voted, not women.
Men.
No women voters, just black men.
Men.
Just black men.
Men only.
Oh, yes,
That's what it said.
yes. Sorry. Blacks insist, black men insist, that they are going to vote. And here in Talbot County, the political dynamic between Republicans and Democrats is different than it is in many other areas of the South. Here in Talbot County, Republicans and Democrats were pretty much equally split. And there were some white Republican politicians who saw it to their advantage to keep blacks voting. And so in Talbot County, you had black voting well after in other areas of the South it's been stamped out. The other area that blacks emphasized, perhaps as much if not more so than exercising the vote, was schooling, education. And I think we have, Kathy, a picture. There's a picture of voting and then moving on. That's a schoolhouse. Schoolhouse that was used exclusively by black kids at the turn of the century. Now, blacks wanted education for their youth. That should not be a surprise. What is a little more surprising is that they got white support for that. At least some whites supported here in Talbot County education for black youth. And they did it for a couple of reasons. Number one, they did it because at least some thought that they could have better control over black people if they had a modicum of education. Similar to what went on in the North when Irish or Italian or Polish immigrants got off the boat, and there was a feeling on the part of many good WASPs, we have to educate these people. We have to teach them how to speak the language. Even more importantly, we have to teach them how to behave, how to be good middle-class folks. Well, a similar notion was here, at least for some whites, in terms of black youngsters. There was also a feeling that black youngsters in particular needed a particular kind of education. They're never going to go on to college, obviously. They're not even going to go on to high school. But they are going to need some certain basics in terms of particularly technical education to be good laborers. And so a system of black public education was put in place. Now, it was never on a par with white public education. In fact, there's a picture here. I guess if we don't. I guess we skipped that picture. I had a picture of literally a used schoolhouse being transported down one of the rivers here in Talbot County and being delivered to be used by black youngsters. You couldn't build a new schoolhouse for them. You went out and got a used schoolhouse from someplace and brought it for them. Okay, moving on. How are we doing here? All right. Want to very quickly, Joe Gray, Nathan Nace Hopkins. Either of those names mean anybody to anybody? Which one? Excuse me?
Hopkins.
Nace.
Hopkins?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, if we could push on from there, Kathy.
Gotcha.
Let's push beyond that. There is Nace Hopkins. Nace Hopkins was a political leader in what town? Trapp. That's right. That's him and 3 of his kids. If we go on from that, Kathy, I think we have Nace Hopkins became known in Trapp, not for being a political leader. He became known for this. Anybody know what it is?
Parade.
Yeah, it's a parade. And it's a parade that Nace Hopkins put on once a year to celebrate emancipation, freedom. He put it on November 1st, every year. Big hoopla. We don't have a picture of him, unfortunately. But Hopkins would get all dressed up. He had military regalia. In fact, the parade became known as, Nace Parade. Move on from that, please. This is a plaque. Some of you have seen it. Down right off of Route 50 in Trapp. The white people of Trapp and some black people have put this up in honor of Hopkins. You don't find many of those south of the Mason-Dixon line that have been put up in communities, particularly communities that are largely white communities. But Hopkins had one. And he did it, or they did it for Hopkins, because he was thought of as a great civic leader. He put on this parade. He did some other things in terms of schooling and the like. What folks don't quite realize is this parade that Hopkins put on November 1st, what happens on November 2nd or November 3rd or November 4th? Elections. And so Hopkins would get all these black folk coming into Trapp. In fact, I've got quotes again from this one farmer who was going crazy that every year all of the workers on his farm would simply get up and leave. They wouldn't ask for permission. Forget it. We're going into town to the parade. And, oh, by the way, the day after the parade, we're gonna vote. We're gonna vote Republican, the party of Lincoln. And so Hopkins was a major player in the Republican Party. But he was never labeled as such. He was labeled for this. On the other hand, there was another black leader in Easton, a fellow who practically no one has heard of today. He worked with Hopkins. Hopkins and Joe Gray in Easton worked hand in hand. But nobody remembers Gray. And the reason that nobody remembers Gray, well, a couple of reasons. Number one, Easton was not particularly friendly to black people, at least not as friendly as Trapp was. But the prime problem that Joe Gray had is he made no bones about the fact that he was a politician. In fact, he was such an uppity politician, he had the effrontery to run for office. First black man to run for political office in Talbot County, 1880. He runs for, of all things, sheriff. Sheriff. And he almost wins. Came in second. Well, both Gray and Hopkins died poor. Both of them tried to become homeowners. Neither one really succeeded. Hopkins tried even to become a real estate developer. That got flushed down the toilet. But Hopkins at least has this. Gray, in fact, you won't even find, I found one history book that's got Gray's name in it, whereas Hopkins at least is remembered. All right, finally, moving on. Who's been to Unionville? Fair number of folks. Okay. Unionville, a black community that is developed after the Civil War. Is that unusual? Yes, no? I hear yeses. No. Actually, it's not. After the Civil War is over, there's any number of what have been called black towns that spring up in the Midwest primarily on the part of black people who are saying, we are getting the hell out of here. We ain't staying in South Carolina, we're not staying in Louisiana, not staying in Mississippi. We're leaving and we're going to set up our own community. Must be 75 to 100 of them that were set up. Unionville, though, is unique. And it's unique for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's still there. Most of these other black communities are long gone. They're ghost towns. Unionville's still there. Secondly, what makes Unionville somewhat unique is that the original, let me underline this, some of the original settlers were veterans. Veterans. Veterans of what? The Civil War. Halfway through the Civil War, Mr. Lincoln and others came to the conclusion, why should white men just be getting shredded up in this war machine? Let's have black men as well put their lives on the line. And so by 1863, blacks were being enlisted into the Civil War, into the Union Army. Most of them did the work that white soldiers didn't want to do. They dug ditches, they built fortifications, they were placed into the most unsanitary, inhospitable situations, and they died in droves. The prime killer of black soldiers during the Civil War was disease, not bullets. Here, however, again, Talbot County is a little different. Many of the black men who went off to war during the Civil War wound up in two regiments, the 4th and the 7th, United States Colored Infantry, it was called. and they actually fought. And they fought damn well. So well that they were wounded and killed in numbers far outstripping what you would have thought. They come home after the war is over, and at least a cadre of those folks, a dozen, 15 or so, say, we want a home of our own. And they find it outside of Easton in a place called well, actually it's not called Unionville. Initially it's called Cogilltown or Coggletown, I don't remember exactly. And the reason it's called that is because of the third reason that makes Unionville different. Even though Unionville was settled by all black people, it was not established by a black person. It was established by that guy, Ezekiel Cogill. Cogill, most whites view Cogill as some kind of lunatic. He comes from Delaware. He's a Quaker, so he's already different, real different. He comes from Delaware in the 1850s, and he buys a godforsaken farm over on the Miles River Neck. Farm was called Lombardy. It had been abandoned. He buys it, and he begins to develop it. He develops it with black workers, not slaves. Workers that he pays a decent wage to. When the Civil War breaks out, he's too old to go fight, but his son, John, enlists and becomes an officer of black troops. After the war is over, he begins to lease land in this place on Miles River Neck to black veterans and other blacks. Initially it's called after him, Cogillton, but very quickly it becomes known as Unionville for obvious reasons. And Unionville develops in the 1870s and the 1880s. By 1880, if we can move on, Kathy. Here it is. Here's Unionville, another black town that developed. Copperville, not much left of Copperville today. I had to really look long and hard to find. There's signs for it, but you're hard pressed to find it. Right in the middle is Tunis Mills. I have a feeling folks are familiar with Tunis Mills. Interestingly, Tunis Mills in this day was an all-white community. So Unionville develops. It develops. This is the center of Unionville. These are names of the individuals who have, originally they rented land from Ezekiel. And he would rent them land for $1, $2, $3. And if they didn't have $1 or $2 or $3, they could give it to them in potatoes or carrots or whatever they might have that had some value. Initially, he gave them 30-year leases. And then after a while, he's giving them 90-year leases. and then he dies. And his son, James Kogel, takes over, and his son does something even more radical than the old man did. The old man leased to these black folk. The son sells them. He sells them land. Now, today we say, well, what's the big deal? He sold them land. No white man sold a black man land in the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s. It just didn't happen. You got run out of town if you talked about doing that. Kogel did it, and he got away with it. Why did he get away with it? It's an interesting question, why he got away with it. My sense is, well, you know, that's over there in Unionville. Nobody ever goes, no white person ever goes there, for God's sake. We're just going to sort of turn our head. But for whatever reason, he got away with it. And Unionville sort of develops. And Kathy, we could move on. We have the schoolhouse that they're bringing, the second-hand schoolhouse to Unionville. Moving on from there. A church is established. Anybody ever seen the church? Yeah, still there. In fact, what was it, 5 years ago, I think, they celebrated the 150th anniversary of Unionville, and the center of that celebration was the church. The church, if we could move on from that, Kathy, that's a list of the folks who contributed to the building of the church. There was a series of temporary churches from 1870 to 1880, but in the middle of the 1890s they said we need a permanent church. We did a fundraising campaign, and if you can read that, which you probably can't, you will see that probably the largest contribution, these are all black folk who contributed, and probably the average contribution was $3, $4. Well over 100 people, a couple hundred people contributed, which in and of itself is amazing because by the 1890s, about 100 people lived in Unionville, and yet several hundred contributed. Which is to say, this wasn't just a Unionville church, it was a church for black folk throughout all of Miles River Neck. They raised over $1,000, and the church still stands today. Unionville still stands today. And so in some respects, Unionville is a tribute to the persistence of black folk in this area, their commitment to establishing a home of their own. In all honesty, Unionville is not the Unionville of 100 years ago. And it's a reflection of the fact that the forces of, if you want to call it modernity, have made it very difficult for that kind of town to persist. But irrespective, it still persists. And it is a reflection of the persistence and the commitment of black people in Talbot County to this middle way that we talked about. So, thank you. Can we go back to the,
Thank you,
to the thank you? These are folks who helped with the research. I particularly want to, I mentioned Peggy before, Becky Reedy at the Talbot County Library, Martina Cato at the Maryland Center up in Baltimore. How many of you have been to the Unicorn bookstore? More of you should go. If you like books and you want to be entranced with the history of this area, nobody knows the history of this area better than Jim Dawson. Jim not only runs that bookstore, but he is a local historian. He's written 3 or 4 books on local history, and he's just a real gem. So I want to give him a nod for all his help. He was a great help on the research I did. Okay, so questions about all of this? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
I remember reading.
And you're going to have to yell because I am so deaf.
Oh, okay. And I don't have the best lungs. So, I remember reading about like a march, a political march from Unionville to Easton. And it was a snippet in the paper, and of course I've never read anything more about it. I think it was in an article about Koval's son.
About what?
Koval's son.
Hold the mic up to your mouth.
Koval's son.
Oh, yeah, I got you.
So I read in an article, one of those rare articles that have details like that. Can you hear me? That there was a march, some kind of political march, where the population, the African American population, perhaps restricted to Unionville, perhaps not, marched on Easton for some reason. And Cole's son was involved. I think it was an article about his son. I guess you haven't run into that, so that little piece of information, I'm a little curious about it.
Okay, so to be honest with you, I didn't catch what the question was.
Did you happen to encounter any information about a march, a political
Yeah.
march from Unionville to Easton, sometime after the Civil War?
Yeah. That was Kogel's other son.
Oh, okay.
He had 2 sons. One of whom was a officer in the black troops, an aspiring politician who led this march on election day.
Right.
Yeah, from Unionville to Easton, if I'm not mistaken. And different interpretations are given to it. One interpretation is he was simply trying to whip up support for blacks voting in the election. And the other interpretation was, since everybody was in military regalia, and there was even some brandishing of firearms, that it was an effort at perhaps intimidating some folks as well, or at least saying to white people, don't mess with us.
That's what I thought.
But whatever, that son had a reputation. He leaves.
Right.
He doesn't stick around Talbot County. And it's his other son who does the real estate development, if you want to call it that. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I do have a little question, Mr. Messner. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative.
Sure.
There were quite a few things I did not know about Unionville. And I've always called it Unionville since we've been on the shore.
Yeah.
But I wonder, in your research, have you researched Bellevue or right here in Easton?
Yeah.
The Glenwood Avenue section
Sure.
of the local school?
Yeah. This gentleman very appropriately mentions that Unionville is not the only black community that develops. In fact, there is a variety of black communities that develop just within Talbot County during these years. Bellevue, which is where the ferry goes to, At one point in time, as you may be aware, there was an incredible packing house there. I've looked for the residue of it. I can't find it, but maybe I'm not looking in the right place. The interesting thing about the packing house was it wasn't black-owned, at least I don't think it was, but the individuals who owned it used primarily, if not exclusively, black workers in that packing house, and Bellevue became pretty much an all-black community during the late 19th, early 20th century. In some respects, it was probably more vibrant than Unionville, because it had this packing house as the center of it, and people were earning wages. And then of course, you mentioned right here in Easton, around the church, I'm blanking on the name of the church, on Hanson Avenue, the Hill, one of the oldest black communities in the nation, actually. And they're not the only ones. Yes, sir.
How active was the Klan at that time?
What was that?
How active was the Klan in Talbot County?
There is no evidence of the Klan in Talbot County. No evidence. In fact, this is what's known as a dubious distinction. There is no evidence of a lynching in Talbot County. Now, I say that is a dubious distinction. Can you imagine being proud of the fact we didn't lynch anybody? Having said that, they came close. In the 1920s was really the heyday of the Klan. There was a incident in which I think it was a white youngster, was murdered. A black man was accused of it, and it took every bit of effort on the part of the governor to get that guy out of Talbot County ahead of the lynch mob. They took him to Baltimore, and he was executed in Baltimore. He didn't escape that.
He wasn't, no.
But no, I've never seen any evidence that here in Talbot there was a lynching. Yes, sir.
You sort of omitted Frederick Douglass.
Excuse me?
You left Frederick Douglass out of your talk?
Yeah, I did. There's a lot of things I can include in the talk, and I went over my time anyway. But one of the reasons I didn't include them, well, number one, because there's been a lot done on Frederick Douglass. Number two, Douglass was enslaved here, but he left Talbot County in, the 1830s. And my focus is after the Civil War. Now, you may refute that by saying, well, he came back. And he did come back several times. Came back to Y House in the 1880s. And depending on how you read what went on at Y House, he came back. The owner of Y House at that time, Ed Lloyd VII, just conveniently wasn't home. He was in Baltimore. But his son was there. And seemingly his son was gracious and greeted Douglass and all. And Douglas had a good visit and spoke, according to the record, highly of the Lloyds. Now, whether he was doing that just to be politic or not, who knows? The Lloyds have an interesting history vis-a-vis their enslaved workers. 400 of them. They made no bones about the fact that they didn't know most of these slaves. And so the discipline on that plantation was not left really to the Lloyds, it was left to their overseers, and the overseers were not kind and gentle. And there's ample evidence that it was pretty tough discipline on the Y plantation. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Sure.
I just like with Dorsey, I learned a lot too. But I was wondering, could you speak about the Union soldiers
Sure.
who were released in Texas after the Civil War
Yeah.
and walked
Yeah.
1,500 miles
Yeah.
from there
Yeah.
back to Unionville?
Yeah. Well, you just told them. That's absolutely the truth. 1,500 miles. These black soldiers were among the last to be mustered out. 1867. The war was over in 1865. They shipped a lot of these guys down to the godforsaken, you'll forgive me if you're from Texas, but it was not a nice place to go, and they suffered down there for a year or two, walked back, and then some of them were among the founders of Unionville. One of the interesting things about Unionville, I mean, this is part, you're going to excuse me for using the term mythology, oral history might be a better way of putting it, of Unionville, that it was founded by Union soldiers. Sort of. Some of the founders were Union soldiers. But as I went through the census for Unionville, there were a lot of other folk, black folk, who were never in the Army, who settled that town as well. And unfortunately, they don't get the credit that the Union veterans have gotten. The other thing is there's 18. If you go over to the church in Unionville, there's a plaque there, 18 names on it. I can't find some of those names in the census.
I came down from a mountain to the sea below, saw myself and the girl I love. And I'm never going back up. And this I